Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Racial Justice, Equity, and the Role of Childcare Part 2 webinar. My name is Kiami Harris. I am the Director of Learning and Events here at CCAoA of America. Just wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded and will be placed on our website for you to view again. Also, you will receive a recording and the slides in an email that will come from us shortly after the webinar. We will be having a panel discussion today and we'll be taking as many questions as we can. So we invite you to use the Q&A box right on your screen to pose any questions to the panelists that you have. Now I want to turn it over to our Chief Executive Officer, Lynette Fraga. Lynette?
Thank you so much, Kiami, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to everyone for joining us for this second webinar in our series on racial justice, equity, and the role of childcare. I do hope each of you were able to join us for a tremendous launch of this series. However, if you were not, a recording of the first webinar is available on our website at childcareaware.org, so I do encourage you to take a listen. It's pretty tremendous. So as we begin this next conversation that I know will be just as excellent, I greatly appreciate your joining our learning as an organization and as a field of practice. As I've said so many times before and will continue to say because it is so important, our work is squarely centered in the core tenets of social and economic justice, that equitable opportunities are available to children and families and communities, and we believe that each and every child should have access to quality early childhood programs that support the nurturing and learning so that they are able to grow and to thrive along with their families and communities. And we also join into this conversation with the learning and growth mindset, wanting to center our work in the lived experiences of people of color and deepen our own commitment to equity and equity-driven practice, policy, research, and structures. If you are unfamiliar with CCAoA of America, please visit our website to learn more about all the work we do in program and practice and research and policy change. We commit ourselves as a child-centered, family-engaged, community-based, and equity-driven organization, and we are committed to ensuring that equity is central to re-envisioning the childcare system. We need to challenge ourselves and the system to achieve what we believe each and every child deserves. And we're also committed to identifying resources and experts that can help the childcare field achieve this vision. Learn and have a dialogue, open the conversation in real ways, and importantly, take action to be accountable. And that is why we have created this webinar series. So now I'd like to turn it over to Ami Gadia, our Chief of Policy and Advocacy, who will moderate today's discussion. Ami?
Thank you so much, Lynette. Welcome, everyone. I would love to now introduce you to our amazing speakers today. We have with us today, very fortunate to have them, are Dr. Ioma Iruka and Dr. Brenda Jones-Harden. Dr. Iruka is the Chief Research Innovation Officer and Director of the Center for Early Education Research and Evaluation at HighScope, which provides strategic direction and leads national and local projects. Dr. Iruka is engaged in projects and initiatives focused on how evidence-informed policies, systems, and practices in early education can support the optimal development and experiences of children from low-wealth households and ethnic minority children, such as through family engagement and support, quality rating and improvement systems, and early care and education systems and programs. Dr. Iruka has been engaged in addressing how best to ensure excellence for young, diverse learners, especially Black children, such as through development of a classroom observation measure, examination of non-traditional pedagogical approaches, public policy, and publications geared towards early education practitioners and policymakers. She has a BA in psychology from Temple University, an MA in psychology from Boston University, and a PhD in applied developmental psychology from the University of Miami, Florida. Before joining HighScope, Dr. Iruka was at the FPG Child Development Institute at the University of UNC Chapel Hill and the Buffett Institute at the University of Nebraska. Our other speaker today is Dr. Brenda Jones-Harden. She is the Allison Richmond Professor for Children and Families at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Dr. Jones-Hardin directs the Prevention and Early Adversity Research Laboratory, where she and her research team examine the developmental and mental health needs of young children who have experienced early adversity and toxic stress. You'll be hearing more about that today, particularly those who have been maltreated or have experienced other forms of trauma. Particular focus of Dr. Jones-Hardin's work is preventing maladaptive outcomes in these populations through early childhood programs. She has conducted numerous evaluations of such programs, including early care and education, home visiting services, parenting interventions, and infant mental health programs. Dr. Jones-Hardin is a scientist practitioner who uses research to improve the quality and effectiveness of child and family services and to inform child and family policy. She received a PhD in developmental and clinical psychology from Yale University and a master's in social work from New York University. Please help me to welcome our wonderful speakers. I'll turn it over to Dr. Iruka now.
Hello, everybody. Making sure I was on video. Hope you can hear me. First, I want to thank Kiami, Lynette, and Ami, and obviously the whole Child Care Web America team for having me join this webinar with my great friend and colleague. So it should be fun. So put your seatbelt on with Brenda. So I'm very thrilled to be here. So I'll go ahead to the next slide, please. So we just want to set the stage because at the end of it, we want to engage with everybody who is able to attend this webinar. So I want to be able to get your questions, but I want to at least set a few things outright and set the stage. So first is we know the science of early development. We know that early experiences are essential, right? But just like the workforce essential, these experiences are essential for building brain connections that really underlie any of the biobehavioral health and the whole child development. Really, it relies on both experiences for organ system development and for children's regular development. But we also know that early adversity can change the timing of critical periods of brain development, impacting the plasticity of developmental processes that are really driven by experiences in the life of the young child and the family. And what's really important for us, especially in today's context, is that both institutional racism and interpersonal experience of discrimination, biases, can influence the health and well-being of both children and adults in many, many ways. And this, to me, is what is really has not fully promulgated the literature and discussion about children's development. The institutional racism has an impact on children and families, in addition to reducing access to material resources and services, and also ability to have long-term and healthy outcomes. And because racism in itself and other interpersonal experiences of discrimination, they act as stressors that can lead to even poorer outcomes than even before. Next slide, please. And what we know now is that healthy development of children does not begin after birth. It begins at preconception. So that's really prenatally, right? So it begins really early, right? We know now from science that even a lot of the stressors, for example, that Black people experience in the teenage years actually sets an environment for the pregnancy that's eventually going to happen later on in life. And so that's really dependent on children having the right experiences that are free of toxic stress and obviously free of racism and all of its subsequent outcomes. So among the things that we know really buffer against negative outcomes are really supportive relationships, right, between children and adults. And those are really essential. And again, this is where childcare and the workforce members really is critical, is that those relationships really are buffers, but are really just also create positive outcomes for children. Next slide, please. And so just to sort of, because there's a lot I could say, right? There's a lot I could talk about, but at least when we think about what are some things that we can do to really address some of the stressors and to address some of the toxicity that families are experiencing, especially when we think about issues of racism or even issues having to do with COVID and the loss of routines, the loss of family members, is I will call it these 4 E's, right? Of how do we support families and how could childcare, especially now when a lot of families aren't using childcare as much, right? Because we're all either locked in the house, or we're all trying to be safe, particularly for those who may have underlying conditions or have family members who have underlying health conditions. And so what are the 4 E's? Next slide, please. And so the 4 E's are really about these things: exploration, expectation, education, and empowerment. Click again one more time for me, Tony, please. Um, and so what is the role of childcare, right? So part of childcare is not just to provide services, but it's also to really support families and subsequently children. And so part of that is that we have to explore what a family's lived experiences, what are their resources, not just what are all the adversities and all the tragedies, right? What are all the good and all the bad, right? We have to know who are families, what they bring with them, what then they have. But we also have to use that as a tool to understand children, right? Because for young babies, they don't speak to you in the same way, obviously through verbalization. However, families could be the ones that could tell you what are the needs of children, what are their experiences that could help to mold them, and also how they are situated in your environment. And so are there things that parents are doing now that they did not do before? For example, I have a 3 and just turned 7-year-old. I mean, before I didn't check in on her work, my 7-year-old, but now I have to, right? Are there things that we're doing more of? We're probably doing a lot more cooking, which I don't like to do, right? So there's some things that parents are doing, and so we can begin to maybe build on that when children are able to return to childcare, especially if they're not there now. Are there needs that are not being addressed, right? That we can help be supportive of, right? And so again, we need to understand what our families bring in and where do they need our help, not our pity, but where do they need our help. Next slide, please. And the other is about expectation. Can you click it one more time, Tony? And this is the idea that part of childcare or any other entities or services is to really expect the most and best from families and families of children. So one of the biggest predictor of children's outcomes is expectation, right? Children rise up expected of them. Similarly with families, you know, the one thing I feel like I hear a lot more of that I'm not sure I like the narrative is, oh my goodness, all the losses that children are going to have in their achievements. And in my head, I think, well, yeah, they're probably going to lose that they don't, you know, there's certain vocabulary words they're not going to have because that's not part of their everyday experience. But there's so much that they're gaining. And so to me, to expect that families are not going to do their best, even in the midst of stress, especially if you're a family of color, Black families specifically, to expect that families are going to just sit around and not really try to support their children's emotional development, to support their language development, to me just speaks to how we view families in particular, particularly families in poverty and families of color, that but for childcare, but for school systems, the children would just wallow away and just, you know, not have any brain cells. And I think that's actually the worst kind of narrative, is just this idea of full of losses. And we don't think about what are children gaining by being with their families on a daily basis. They're gaining that affirmation. They're gaining even stronger attachment. They gain a different understanding about what is it that makes my parents tick, right? My kids see me all day in front of a Zoom camera. They hear me speaking, right? They're gaining so much language just by being around me. And so I think we have to think about what are the things that families are doing that we never considered valuable, but is really valuable for children's development on so many levels. Are there obstacles that we create that doesn't support families to do their best? And so I think, to me, we have to not sort of create this narrative that families don't know much and don't do much, because families are really central to children's development. Next slide, please. And then the idea of, and then click it one more time, Tony, thank you, of education is not formalized education, but in what ways can child care and other systems of care for families educate families about system opportunities, right? Part of the job is not just to let me take your child and fix them, quote unquote, right? But it's to let me be sure to build your capacity to be the best, right? To take some of the stress away, but also to inform you, because I will not always be here, but you will be, AKA parents. And so our job should be about how do we educate families about what are the opportunities, particularly to gain assets, I would argue, what are the opportunities to develop networks, social capital. And so how can we be part of developing families' capital by creating peer networks? Are there supports that they're not able to normally get without our support? Can we open the doors and be the gateway? I always say that part of childcare and early care education writ large should be about helping families, you know, find out about the well, right? Like but not, you don't have to necessarily just feed it to them, but you can teach me, how do I find this well of resources and information to best support me as a parent, but also to support my child. Next slide, please. And then finally, the idea of empowerment. I think that's always the word we think about with families, but I say really it's about equipping families to navigate and challenge a system, right? When we think about what we know now is that the system of any kind, including childcare, early care education, was not built really for poor families, was definitely not built for families of color and Black families in particular. And so the job is to begin to equip families to advocate and push the system to do more and meet their needs as opposed to sort of meet this Eurocentric value or middle class value. And so to me, part of it is how do we equip families to advocate, to create anti-racist and anti-bias systems that provide opportunities for families to do their best. Are we equipping families through a Eurocentric lens? Are we equipping them to say, hey, what do we think we need to create to best meet the needs of your family based on the circumstances and based on your experience about what is most needed? And whose humanity are we empowering? Who are we equipping with all the privilege and access and resources? So to me, part of childcare is to ensure that families have information, have the tools, have the strategies, either whether they're with you or whether they're not whether they're not with you. Next slide, please. And then I'll just sort of close the last two slides by just basically saying that how do we get to that? What is the role of childcare? It's to view families and parents as equal partners. I think COVID-19 has reminded us that parents are central. They are the first teachers. If we forgot that, I hope we got a reminder that the kids are with the families, and anything you need to do to reach children is going to be through the families. We have to tailor interventions to meet the specific needs of families, not what you think they need, but what they believe they need. We need to integrate services. We can't just assume that families are going to go to A, Y, B, C, all that to get their needs. We need to integrate things because children have complex needs and so do families. And we have to create opportunities for parents to receive support. And it can't only be to walk through your door, but it's how do we create capital within communities, within networks, within family systems. Next slide. And then we have to address trauma. And I want to say this very specific and clearly. While we focus on adverse child experiences, I think those are all important that Felitti and colleagues have all talked about, from abuse and neglect to those sort of things. We have to also acknowledge that racism in itself, because of its pernicious nature, is ability to live whether or not we wanted to live or not, that it has such traumatic effects on families, particularly Black families, that we have to begin to truly address it from both a systematic way, but also through individual. How do we continue to traumatize families, even if we don't see it? And so we need to think about that through many of our lenses and many of our opportunities. And childcare is not immune from issues of racism. And so we have to begin to empower families and provide opportunities for them to thrive and build assets so that they don't have to come, quote unquote, begging for subsidy and be mistreated as well. So we have to think about trauma, not just from the ACEs, adverse child experiences frame, but from the racism frame of things that has not fully been recognized and fully been addressed. And that means that we have to make programs culturally relevant and sustaining by meeting families where they are and not where we think that they should be. And also in thinking about how do we involve fathers and those who are father figures as well. And final slide, I think, if there's another final slide, I can't remember. So thank you. I want to kind of go a little quickly because I do want us to be able to eventually have conversations after Brenda. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Yoma. I always enjoy being with you too. We're together a lot these days, and I'm going to pick up where Yoma left off so you can move on to the next slide. I'm going to approach this from the perspective of Sean Koff's 3 levels of stress. And I'm sure many of you have heard that. You heard in my background that I'm very invested in thinking about trauma and its impact on children who are from low-income backgrounds, particularly African-American children. And if you recall these 3 levels of stress, he talked about positive stress as, you know, that kind of stress when you all were trying to hurry up and get to your phones in time to get to the webinar. No biggie, right? And then he talked about tolerable stress, these kind of life hits, big hits that are made tolerable by the relationships you have. You have a mama, you have a daddy, you have a grandma, you have a granddad, you have your children, you have your spouse, people who really help you through life's big hits. But then he talked about this third level called toxic stress, and that's where the children who've experienced trauma that Ioma talked about. And what we know about that level of stress is that what happens to the body, they talk about how stress gets under the skin. This is the stress that gets under the skin, where you have a prolonged activation of the stress response system. But look at that last phrase. This is the important phrase, and this is the phrase that has implications for you as child care providers, people who are setting child care policy, in the absence of protective relationships. In other words, even though you might have these horrific stressors, if you have protective relationships, somehow that helps the body to rebound and it helps the psyche to rebound. Next slide. So you all heard Ioma talk about the importance of thinking beyond the ACEs, and Ellis and Dietz have given us a very nice, I love trees, so I really particularly like this particular diagram, where they talked about the pair of ACEs. They talked about the adverse childhood experiences that we all know about. We've gotten many, many trainings and professional development activities around this ACEs. But do note, and I have these little blue arrows to help you think about this, that one of the things that Ellis and Dietz put squarely in their definition of these adverse child experiences is racism. And if you think about things like the weathering hypothesis, for example, that says the chronic experiences of racism, whether it's microaggressions or those big kind of racist acts like what children are watching and observing and experiencing now, those kinds of things have an impact on your system and can lead to trauma in the way Ioma talked about. The American Psychological Association, in fact, suggests that the experiences of this kind of racism can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. But then they talk also about this other one of the pair of ACEs that Ioma alluded to as well, these adverse community environments. So we have to pay attention to things like poverty and poor housing and violence in the communities and all that kind of stuff. But also do note that Ellis and Dietz also talked about discriminatory practices like what we see in redlining and other kinds of housing policy, but also structural racism. Like, I do a lot of work in child welfare, and one of the questions we have about that system is why there's a disproportionate number of Black children in that system. Is it because Black children are more likely to be exposed to all kinds of stressors, or could it be that this particular institution has its share of structural racism? Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So those kind of precipitants of toxic stress do lead to a lot of consequences, right? And so if you look on the consequences of toxic stress column I have, we know again that this kind of stress gets under the skin, right? There's a biological embedding, if you will, of these kinds of experiences that lead to effects on three very important physiologic systems in our bodies: the immune system, the neuroendocrine system, and the central nervous system. And you all have been to lots of professional development activities, I would bet, on the brain, so you know about how stress affects the brain. It's more likely to make the brain smaller, less plastic, less likely to grow, and it affects some very important parts of the brain, like the limbic system, where a lot of our emotion regulation and things like that lie. Neuroendocrine system, you've probably heard about cortisol, that stress hormone, and how we know that what happens when you experience these kinds of intensive stressors is that your hormonal system gets off balance. So you think about folks who might have all kinds of cortisol running through their body. So they're always in that fight flight mode, ready to take on somebody because they don't think the world will treat them well, right? Versus, and we might even think about these people as even having more adverse consequences, people who have this kind of blunted pattern of cortisol production where it's almost like the body is shutting down. Well, actually, we can see lots of physical manifestations of this kind of stress that's getting under the skin, affecting these very important physiologic systems. So, for example, you see increased rates of asthma, which has to do with chronic inflammation, obviously impacts on the immune system, cardiovascular disease similarly. But also on the psychological side, we see lots of mental health issues that result from the experience of these kinds of stressors. And remember, we talked about these stressors being racism and discrimination and all those kinds of things. And if your body has experienced that over time, it starts to, have an impact on your body. And think about it intergenerationally as well. So you do see increased rates of depression, anxiety, aggression, substance use disorders, and even some literature suggests cognitive delays. And I wanted to juxtapose that to what we know about racial inequities, right? So we know, for example, that there is a very high rate of maternal and infant mortality in the Black community. Now, we know from this research that it's regardless of class. So we can't argue that this is because, Black people are more likely to be from low-income backgrounds, because you see this regardless of class. Clearly, one can think about this kind of intergenerational stress, this weathering on the body that's leading women to have preterm birth and low birth weight birth, and in fact, die from childbirth, which is something we, should have gotten rid of many generations ago. You know about the high rates of asthma in the African American community, particularly among children, and the Black-white disparity between asthma rates in low-income communities in particular, but across the SES spectrum. Although some studies are now suggesting that the Black-white differential is sort of plateauing, it's not growing, it still exists, right? Now, interestingly enough, and here is one place where you might argue that here's some resilience that you see, you really don't see the same disparities in mental health outcomes for Black versus white communities. That said, you see a lot of differential in access to mental health service delivery. So one might argue that some of the rates of increased suicide that we're seeing and increased conduct disorder and those kinds of things really don't have to do with the mental health disorder itself, but has to do with access to treatment. Okay, next slide. So then what we can think about for childcare providers and people who are working on creating childcare policy and childcare organizations to support childcare providers, this is one of my favorite slides. I use it all the time. This is from the Center for the Developing Child as well. And they obviously talk about the most optimal time to buffer children against adversities. And you all know that this has come out in all kinds of literature. It's even come out in the economics literature where they've talked about return on investment. But basically, this particular slide suggests if you want to make a difference, you want to make the difference when a child care provider has access to children. So when I talk to child care providers and people who are creating child care policy, I often say, you have these children's lives in your hands because you have the opportunity to alter their developmental trajectory. So look at this slide where it shows this is about the brain's ability to change. It is at its most plastic in the early years. And if we could look at the economic return on investment, you see the same kinds of things. You're more likely to have an economic return on investment when you intervene in children's lives in the early years. Okay, go on to the next slide, Tony. Thank you. And so what does that mean for folks who are in the childcare environment? Well, think about it from, again, Jack Shonkoff's level, where he talks about what are the conditions for toxic stress, right? And he has this kind of bifurcated way of thinking about it, right? The stressors that one experiences, but then remember that phrase that I emphasized before, the protective relationships. Well, if you look at that red, hot pink part of the graph there, you see toxic stress occurs when you get lots of chronic high impact stressors, but what you're experiencing on the caregiving side of things are low support and responsivity. That said, even for kids who are experiencing high impact chronic stressors, if they have supportive, responsive relationships, and what do child care providers offer children but that, you don't see children experiencing toxic stress. You see them moving more into that tolerable stress category. go on to the next slide. So for me, child care providers have an important role to play, a critical role to play, if you will, for children who've experienced the chronic stressors that include racism and discrimination and structural inequality. First of all, as Lynette said way at the beginning of this, what we want for children, this is the cornerstone of what they're going to receive. And although, as Ioma said, we have to recognize what parents are able to offer children, the import for us from the child care perspective is that children always get high quality, responsive, and nurturing care. If they get that, they have an opportunity to be buffered against some of these kind of stressful experiences like racism. So that is the sine qua non. We really, really want to make sure that children are experiencing that, especially when they're spending 8-10 hours away from their families. But also, we can think about more classroom-based and individual strategies for helping children to understand race. We know from the science that even babies can detect racial differences, and they're more comfortable with races that they're familiar with, even early on. So we have to understand that and expose children to all kinds of races, but also really support their psychological well-being. Because again, if you go back to Jack Shonkoff's idea, this supportive, responsive kind of relationship is what's going to buffer them against some of the stressful experiences they have. Now, for parents, we obviously want child care programs to think about supporting parental well-being, helping parents to get jobs, right? To address those kind of adverse community experiences, if they're experiencing violence and all that kind of stuff. But also think about interventions that might reduce some of the inequalities. For example, if we know that Black women are more, and we know this from the data, are more likely to produce infants who die or who are preterm, we need to be engaging those women to make sure they get the kind of community supports, mentors or health workers in the community or midwives or whomever who can help them address the physical challenges that lead to these kinds of inequities. And I have to say something for the staff. One of the things that we know from our work is that staff are often as stressed as some of our parents. So we really want to make sure that there's a lot of support for staff, understanding that they're often stressed. I think about some of the programs that we're working with, and parents are at home, but guess what? The child care providers are parents as well. And they have to do Zoom meetings with their preschoolers, and they also have to see their kids at home. It's crazy. So really thinking about supporting their well-being just like we support parents, but then on the professional development side, helping them to understand that these racial inequities do exist, helping them to understand the data, to think about how racial discrimination can lead to these kind of physiologic and psychological changes in parents, and really, and this is the courageous conversation about it, helping everybody, whether they're Black, white, brown, whatever color, to really address their own racism, because all of us growing up in this country certainly have our own demons in terms of racism that we have to challenge. So with that, I'm going to close and we can open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aruka and Dr. Jones-Harden. Thank you for that, both those presentations, which were full to the brim of amazing, amazing information. I'm going to kick us off with a few questions to get the conversation started, and then I know we'll be getting questions from the attendees in the chat box as well. But to kick us off, one of the questions is, what kind of how can we help childcare resource and referral agencies, or how can we help childcare providers to start the conversations? You mentioned, Dr. Jones-Harden, at the end, the obvious fact that everybody brings their own demons to life, right? And we all have our biases. How do we begin to help childcare providers and the agencies that support them start to do that kind of work with staff and with themselves?
Yuma, you want me to jump in quickly? Yeah. So I'll just start really quickly. I think, first of all, education is critical. And I would start with really helping people to understand that there is such a thing as structural inequities. And a lot of folks that I talk to really don't know that there are these differences in asthma rates, for example, among Black children versus white children, or differences in infant mortality rates. They're surprised to hear that. So I think the first thing to do is to start with education. The second thing I think, and this comes from my own mental health background, these issues are very sensitive, very touchy, and people have a very hard time, one, acknowledging that racism exists. I mean, everybody thought that when Obama came into presidency, we would start this post-racial society and all this kind of stuff. And they want to believe that we are past that. And, I say to my supervisees who are very depressed about now because of all the things that are happening, that yes, we have come a long way, even though we have a lot farther to go. But it's challenging. So one of the things I really believe in is reflective practice. And reflective practice to me is not just about how good you are at being responsive to young children, not about how much you integrate a curriculum into the play. I mean, that's all important. But another part of reflective practice is really thinking about the use of self with others. And as a mental health person, that is something that we have to go through all the time. And sometimes that means looking at your biases in places you don't want to go inside yourself, right? I'll admit, I grew up in a household where I didn't see a white person till I was 11 years old, right? That had to have an impact on me and how I perceive folks. So thinking about those kinds of things and how that affects, and it does affect for all of us, how we interact with other people. You have to think about what pieces of yourself are coming out in ways that may not be necessarily great. And I'll give you one quick example, and then I'm going to let Yoma speak. There's a lot of research about little Black boys and Ioma's done some of this work herself about how little Black boys probably are treated the worst out of everybody and how they have outcomes that look pretty dismal, even compared to little Black girls. And so one of the things that I constantly worry about is when a little Black boy comes into a classroom who's really boisterous and, like Wade Boykin used to talk about, has a lot of verve in him and comes in ready to throw things around in the classroom, and how he's viewed by women teachers and by women teachers who may not be part of a community that's raised these little Black boys. And so their immediate notion is that this child has externalizing behavior problems, instead of thinking about how to make the environment more consonant with who this child is, for example. So then you see, and we know this from data, that little Black boys are being expelled from preschool, from elementary school, and then you know what happens once they hit middle school and high school, right? That kind of expulsion leads to less instruction and things like that. To me, some of this comes from way, way deep inside yourself. And if I were doing a reflective practice circle with teachers, I'd be wanting to ask them questions about, talk to me about how you treat the little boys in your classroom. What do you think is cultural? What do you think is not cultural? What can you do? How do you respond to that child? So really going deep and doing that kind of reflective practice that allows you to think about the issues inside yourself that affect how you engage with the other. So Ioma, I'll let you give a couple comments.
No, I think you did a phenomenal job. It's funny, as my little Black boy, he can't keep him away. I think you said it beautifully, Brenda, that I think part of it is that there needs to be that self-reflection, but I just think there needs to be that education about the history of the US. When you understand the perniciousness with how Black people in particular, again, there are other groups that have been completely vilified and oppressed, But when you think about how Black communities and Black people have been oppressed from 400 years to today, you can understand that if you don't have that level of understanding, that then the things you see may be true. Like it may be that like my Black son here really is, aggressive and needs to be expelled. But now we think about from what if it's because he's been poisoned with lead, right? Because I've been put into a housing unit because I wasn't allowed to live in a less toxic environment, right? So even if all that is true, the fact that there's a system at work. So I think that level of looking at data, that level of looking at the systems, level of educating ourselves about the U.S. system is important. And I think the other piece is to look at the data. Like to me, me and Brenda were both researchers. Your data will tell you a lot. Yeah. Right? Who are the families that have been on subsidy or intergenerationally are always on it? What programs are available in their area? Do you see a pattern, right? I can guarantee you now, if we look at all the quality improvement systems with all their problems and what I will argue is actually a racialized system in itself because of the way it's constructed, that even if you look at it, you'll see, you can probably map on that the low quality programs, quote unquote, are going to be in high minority, particularly Black communities that are low, with low wealth and low resources, right? So even our system that are supposed to provide the highest quality of care are going to look the way we think they're going to look. So we have to look at our data and begin to interrogate, why is it? Is it because the families just love to be poor? No, right? So I think this is part of me is also how does childcare, the CCNR, how they champion that your job is to help support families to be able to work, right, while their children are in care. So how do we begin to do that in a way that says, you know what do we do to give power back to families? What can we do to make sure the system works to ensure they get assets? A lot of times we focus on income. The issue is that it's not the income. And I think as Nicole Hannah Jones put it, you should read the New York Times, she just wrote yesterday. It's not about income. It's about the wealth and access to it. So to me, the way that childcare could really function is to try to help families not have to depend on a system that is not ready. There's so many families that if they need a subsidy today, they can't even access it, right? Because we have a shortage of funding. We're not paying our workforce enough. So there's so much in that. But if we can develop assets in our families, and CCR&R could be the mechanism that says we need to continue to push to support our workforce who are also part of who are also challenged, but also our families in a way that is not position them as always being poor, but create assets, because there are a lot of businesses. Then we can maybe get around the bend. But we have to, I think, do much more introspection and inquiry and look at our data and see how we continue to position the same people in the same place and not changing anything, but just saying, we're going to keep you poor and hope and good luck and we'll pray for you.
Wonderful. No, and I mean, along the lines, you both mentioned education, right, as being a large part of this. So, there are books that are flying off the shelves these days, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Me and White Supremacy, right? Books that, maybe weren't getting the same kind of attention that they deserved before the events of the last month. What resources or where should providers look if they are, we hear what you're saying about education and effective practice, but this is a tough conversation for me to start, right? Where do I start? What are there resources that can help me begin to crack open these conversations?
So, want to go ahead, Brenda? Okay, I'll just quickly say that there's a lot of books out there now, like Rosemary Allen. There's books, but there's also even just digital. There's a lot of conversations. Actually, the beauty of today is that you don't have to crack a book if you don't want to, which you probably should. But there's a lot of different digital outlets, right? We have a lot of Facebook that's happening. We have a lot of Twitter conversations. A lot of the articles that you see you can get for free, because a lot of them are being made for free because we understand that not everybody has resources to buy the New York Times or these other high-end or expensive things. So there are things you can do. But I mean, obviously, me and colleagues have written a book called Don't Look Away, and it's for the workforce, right? That we want the workforce to lean in on this issue, that our workforce, and I think you have Stephanie Currington, who was also co-author of that book, where we are in some ways not begging, but we are like, we need to do better than what we have done. We can't ignore the obviousness of how racism has been part of the child care, early childhood system. It started that way, it's going to continue that way if we don't look squarely at it. And in that same book, we really provide some specific things like interrogate who is in your community, who don't you see, right? How do you look at children? How are you assessing children? How do you even look at interactions? What programs are available? How do we see families, right? So there's some specific steps that we are saying we need to take. We can't do this the same way over and over again. And but I think in the end of it is that there's so much out there. To me, there's almost no excuse for us to not begin somewhere. You can't tell a child, hey, Johnny, go read a book, or hey, parent, go read to your child. If you're not reading, don't tell me to go read, right? So to me, we have to practice what we suggest. So I would say there's a lot of books, and I think we can put on our little iPhone or pod and listen to some stuff. There's a lot of information, and I think childcare providers can get it, and it doesn't have to all be childcare related, but there's enough resources, there's enough experts that, like, you know, that you've already had, obviously Brenda. So there's a lot of different groups that are trying to push it out. I'm part of high school, they're pushing stuff out. T-Stone, I mean, if you turn a rock, they're there. So I think we just have to sort of keep pushing that information, but also provide a network, right? I think in the end of it, some of these conversations, Brenda said, they're hard to have. It's hard to sort of say, well, my parents didn't own slaves. Okay, right? And so I don't get why, right? But this is a system that if you are white, you are privileged from it, and if you are not, you're oppressed by it. So to me, like Rosemary Allen says, you're either anti-racist or you're racist. There is no middle ground, and by us continue to be ignorant to that doesn't help our field move forward. So I say there's a lot of books. Google it. And that's, I hate to be so blunt and so rude, and I don't mean to be rude, but I think we this is not where we don't have computers and iPhones and all these things. We can actually access information, and there really is no excuse to not lean into it.
Yeah, I just will say read Ioma's book and all the things that she said. But I also would say, you know, we are in the business of working with little kids. And one of the things that I collect lots of things like dolls, but I also collect children's books. And there are just some beautiful children's books that really help children to understand race, all the stuff. I love the nappy hair books and all those kinds of books. I recently got one about grandmas, and they're just so beautiful. The artwork is so beautiful. And sometimes I find that not only are those books helpful to children, but they're helpful to providers and teachers as well, who are afraid to do the kinds of courageous conversations that Ioma and I are talking about, where they're looking inside themselves and acknowledging their own racism, whether or not their family, whether they knew their family owned slaves. Of course, we know lots of families owned slaves and didn't know it, but that's okay. But sometimes by, you know, sticking their toe in, by talking to children and reading stories to children, you often see them beginning to make a shift. So I would also argue for us to really do due diligence and have books in our child care environments that really do look carefully at this issue from the child's perspective.
And remind them, Brenda, right? The fact is that kids, like this idea that kids do not see race, and that, you know, when, I mean, I've been in so many sessions and so many webcasts where I hear parents say, you know, my kid, I want to make sure they maintain their innocence and that we don't talk about race at all. And I want to say, I'm glad that you don't, but I have to, right? That my 3-year-old, I have to, because when I had him and I found out I was having a boy, I nearly lost it, because I was like, is he going to live tomorrow? Is he going to live to see 10? That is not the life that I want to lead. And so I need every single parent, and I need childcare providers to understand that kids do see it and they will make up their own mind. And if we are not part of the group that helps them to talk about it, to have a cognitive language about it, to, you know, then we are going to perpetuate it. You know, the officer that killed and murdered George Floyd was a child before. And who was a child care provider in his life that did not have the ability to at least have a conversation about fairness, about justice, about the worth of other people? And to me, that starts pretty early, and we can't all lump it onto the families. Yes, they have that's part of it, but the community helped to do that. And I feel like it's part of our due diligence as the early childhood community, that we understand how brain development works. That a lot of those things are programmed pretty early, and if we are not part of that conversation with children in a developmentally appropriate way, that we become the problem. And that, I think, is what this is calling for us to do. There's a reason why we suspend 36 and 48-month-olds, right? Think about it. Those boys are 36 and 48-month-olds, and we
already
easily.
getting the
That's right.
experience that you are rejected from an environment.
Exactly.
And just to build on what you're saying, I have a colleague who studies interracial relationships. She studies mostly adolescents. Her name is Melanie Killen. And one of the exciting findings she has that is relevant to this conversation is that kids who interact with the other, so, children who don't look like you, those are the children who are more likely to have more positive experiences and have more positive perceptions of people of other racial groups. But when you think about many of our children's experiences, they're growing up in segregated schools, right? Segregated not only by race, but also by class and many other kinds of things. So if you take the person who killed George Floyd, as you're saying, Yoma, I don't know. I haven't done an autopsy of his past, but I wonder, was he one of those kids who was growing up in a very white environment where he didn't have an opportunity for those kinds of relationships? I mean, you gotta get people to the point where they're able to step outside their comfort zone. And it's really hard to do, which is why we should be starting way back when kids are little and having these conversations. And if your kids are going to a segregated environment, making sure that they have other kinds of experiences. I mean, my parents didn't, but I'm old, and it was de facto segregation then, but right now it really is in many, many places. It still is that same kind of thing. So trying to have children have an opportunity to at least reflect on it and think about it and have grown-ups who are willing to help them talk about it is important. You can't pretend that it's not there. Certainly now children are seeing it all on the TV and asking questions. You can't shut it down. So that's very important.
Thank you. And one more question, and then I think we're coming up against the end of our time together today. But this has certainly been all over the news, all over social media, like you said, Dr. Jones-Harden, that kids are hearing it in their world too. And this is eventually going to get replaced by some other insane event in the news cycle that we seem to be living in, right? And so, how do we all continue to do this work within childcare specifically, when it's the spotlight, right? What are things? What are ways that we can continue to make sure that we don't take fighting injustice and inequality, out of the spotlight?
Well, I'll just jump in and I'll let Yoma finish us up. First of all, I prefer to do it when things are not in the spotlight. I actually think that, what we're doing now is very reactive to something that existed before this. It's kind of like, the old folks in my family say, this is not new. This is real. This is what they've experienced all their lives. So for me, I'd rather not take this reactive stance, but sort of think about like that old adage, everything I learned in kindergarten. There are things that we should be teaching children all along that relate to this, like empathy, understanding the other, respecting the other. I mean, that's like basic preschool education from my vantage point. Categorization. We know that that's an important cognitive skill that young children get, which is why you can pretend like they don't see that somebody looks different, but they're learning, why is she that color and why am I this color? Those are opportunities that children's language gives us to sort of teach them the more nuanced social lessons, about history, things like that, that children have lots of questions about. 4-year-olds are known for their why. Well, here's an opportunity for us to say why and to think about hard questions. No, we can't talk to them like they're in college, but we can talk about how some policemen are nice and some policemen aren't nice. I mean, to me, these are conversations that children's development gives us an opportunity to do. And if we are really serious about understanding children's development, that they're cross domains, that we got to think about health, we got to think about mental health, we got to think about cognition, we got to think about language, we got to think about social emotional processing. All this stuff is part of those kinds of things that children are developing an ability to understand. And as good child care providers, we should be really understanding that development and be ready to integrate all those lessons about the very complex society that we live in. And it looks like it's going to be even more complex, but our duty is to help children understand this, not because we're reacting to the news cycle, but because this is important for how children think and face the world.
And I would just say, and I know why Ami's like, oh, there's only one more question, because Brenda and I have such thorough answers or responses. And so I would say this, that if we return back to pre-COVID and we forget these conversations, we forget the lives that are lost and lives that continue to be lost, then all of this is for nothing. Like all the nights that, probably Brenda and myself have been up talking to our, what I would consider potentially white allies, talking to people about what to do differently, that we've been doing before, right? Before people decided to pay attention. So to me, it will basically be what it was. So I am hopeful that even if we think of this as reality television, that a lot of us, this is the lives that we lead. And so I'm hoping that to continue the conversation once the lights dim is going to be how we should go forward, because that is what is going. If we want to really change the trajectory of children, we have to change the system and the way it's operating. The system and the way it operates is not benefiting a lot of our children families, particularly our Black families, our low wealth families. And so if we continue the same way, then all that we've been doing is performing. And Twitter nowadays will call you out, right? So, especially Black Twitter will call you out. So I guess I'm encouraging us to not look away, that even as the cameras turn to something else, because there will be something else. And even if we happen to have a Black vice president, or, which I'm hoping for, of course, that we know that that is not going to solve the system that exists, and that's childcare, the childcare community, early child community, that we now have to interrogate every aspect of what we do, from the standards that we have to the subsidy that we provide, the paperwork, and all that needs to be challenged, to the policies that we have created that have never looked at the impact of it from a racialized lens. So to me, I would hope that everything that we talk about going forward would always have not equity, because that word could go away if you ask me, but have an anti-racist language to it, right? So that means that if we're not talking about anti-racism in every piece, like it's literally embedded in our system. So if we're not talking about it, if we're not educating, if we're not doing professional learning on anything that does not incorporate that, then to me, we have been performing. And that to me would be the worst thing we've been doing, is to take the pain of people to sort of perform it and then not do something in the back end, will be the greatest tragedy, at least for me. I wasn't born in the 60s, and then people are like giving me hope. And I'm like, if 2 months from now, we are not still pushing as hard as we are today, then to me, all of this is performance. And so I would hope that that is not what we're doing, because I could be right now in my bed sleeping, right? Because I haven't slept in at least a month. So I'm hoping that is not what we're doing, because performance is the last thing that we need when we have witnessed a man get killed, and many people get killed. And when I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I will hope that we're not performing. So I hope that you could, here we are here for the community. We are here to do the work. We've been doing the work. And so I hope that whatever we can do, we will do our best, because we're probably going to die early because weathering, because that's exactly what happens. We'll likely die earlier than we need to. But I hope that we can be a resource. But we hope that people continue to put their foot on the gas, knowing that our kids cannot wait, our families cannot wait, and neither can our child care community. And so let's continue to do the work even after the lights dim, because it's not about what you do when the lights are on, it's what you do when the lights are off. And so I'm hoping that our community is going to do that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your time and for I know the emotional labor that's involved in having these conversations, and for your expertise as scientists and researchers and practitioners. We're incredibly grateful for your time today. Hopefully folks caught in the chat box that they'll be sharing out the slides, and we'll have some books and additional resources to share out with folks as well. But I really wanted to thank Dr. Iruka and Dr. James Harden tremendously for their time and knowledge, and we look forward to meeting with you all again for the third in this series. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Yoma.
Bye.
Thank you so much.